All right, let's pull together. We'll have a few come in here in a little bit. Let's get started with the book of Ruth. This is the last book of the semester. Everybody clap. All right, yay. Didn't think we'd get this far, did you? Didn't ever think we'd get out of the book of Genesis, but somehow it always happens. All right, well, the book of Ruth. Like the book of Judges, I think the author of Ruth also gives us a thesis statement. All right, and on this idea that I just talked about when we finished the book of Judges, with regards to looking back and looking forward, or kind of a both and. So the author of Judges is evaluating the situation historically and theologically, this 400-year period of chaos. He asks the question of king, and the answer is, in looking back and looking forward, perhaps there's a little bit of, well, could an earthly king solve the problem? Or is he really asking the question of, no, what we need is a return to God as king, as it was supposed to be all along. That ultimately has to be the solution. And with it, a little bit of maybe a prophetic anticipation of the coming day when God will come back and will be rethroned. What's interesting about the book of Ruth, let's just see how it ends and what the author does at the very end of his book. Let's just jump ahead to the very last chapter and the last few verses. So let's take a look at how this ends. Let's see here. Sarah, let's have you read verses 16 through 21, through 22, chapter 4.
Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor woman gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron was born Ram, and to Ram Amminadab, and to Amminadab was born Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz, and to Boaz Obed, and to Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse David.
So the very last word, right, of the book of Ruth is David, anticipation of King David. And so here it is kind of drawn very simply. Well, we've got this question that the author of Judges is asking with regards to king. Maybe he's anticipating a day when God would be rethroned as king. And what we know about King David is going to have some pretty significant conversations with God. If we turn to 2 Samuel chapter 7, we get to the pivotal Davidic covenant. Let's turn there. And I want to look at verse 19. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 19. Well, actually, if you read this whole oracle from the prophet Nathan, God speaking through the prophet Nathan to King David. Notice in, verse 16 and 17 in chapter 17. "And your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne," that is David's throne, "shall be established forever, in accordance with all these words in the vision so Nathan spoke to David." Now what happens in verse 18, as you know, this is David's prayerful response. He's now reflecting on the implications of this oracle from the prophet Nathan. Notice what he says over here, interesting, in chapter 7, verse 19. Well, I'll start in verse 18. "Then David, the king, went in and sat before Yahweh. And he says, 'Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house that you have brought me this far?'" Verse 19. "And yet this was insignificant in your eyes, O Lord God, for you have spoken also of the house of your servant concerning the distant future." Have you ever thought and scratched your head about that? About the distant future. See, David's recognizing the implications of this repeated idea, everlasting, everlasting, everlasting. Isn't that part of the Hallelujah chorus? "For he shall reign forever and ever. Hallelujah, Hallelujah. Don't like my singing? Okay. But this distant future, it's in verse 19. That's anticipating the future, this distant future. I think there's probably an anticipation that certainly David realizes as king, oh, there's going to be another king that comes down the road. And the implications of that king when he comes, he might be the one to dethrone God as king. Whether there's an earthly representation or not, I don't know. The development of this day of the Lord all goes back, a lot of it goes back to, they're having their quiet time, these prophets. I don't know if that's exact. We don't have, I'm just kind of filling in the color there, but they're reflecting on the implications of the Davidic covenant. Remember the passage we read in Ezekiel in chapter 37? They refer to a king, a Davidic king, to come and be shepherd, and to bring about this restoration and all of that. That all goes back to, I think, what I think King David is anticipating. And now we go back to the author of the book of Ruth. It seems as if the author of Ruth is pointing ahead to and recognizing that there's this overflow of the faithful community in Bethlehem. That's the setting, largely the context for the whole book of Ruth. We're back to Bethlehem. Remember, King David is going to be coming from, right, this same town. It's interesting. So there's a lot of good things coming out of Bethlehem, except for the roaming Levite of the book of Judges. So that might be something to think about here. All of these kind of are making connections. So let's get into the actual story and account of the book of Ruth. Let's turn back to Ruth chapter 1. And let's see here. Derek, could you read for us in the book of Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 and 2? Yep.
In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there.
Okay, so that's the context. What we read, it tells us that we're invited to read the book of Ruth in the same context as the book of Judges. So they're overlapping in terms of the historical period. That's what you have to know. So if you read this long, extended, 21 chapter book of Judges, and you get to the end of it, and you're out of breath, or you're nervous, you've reached your nervous threshold of angst and anxiety because of this dark book that just seems to get worse and worse and worse, you have to read the book of Ruth. 4 chapters. It's a breath of fresh air, and it shows us that within this chaotic stew pot called Judges, there's groups of faithful remnant covenant communities. And here we have the town of Bethlehem as one of those places. So that's important to know. So a famine drives this family to Moab to find famine relief and literally survive, right? And in verse 3, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies. That's tragic. We've talked about the household structure where the first-ranking male member is the head of household. What happens when he dies? Hopefully there's provision to be made for his replacement, and that's the firstborn son. Remember, we talked about that in Deuteronomy. That's why I would say the firstborn son cannot act in rebellion and walk away from that responsibility. Otherwise, he's the victim of putting somebody else's life at jeopardy, and in this case, risking the lives of every member of the household if he reneges or walks away from his responsibility to step into that role, that all-important role. But thankfully, Naomi has a couple sons, verse 3, and she was left with her 2 sons. So the oldest of those 2 sons is going to step in for dad in this case. Now, let's keep reading here. And what did these sons do? While in Moab, they take for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. And they lived there in Moab for about 10 years. And they lived happily ever after. Nope, that's not what we see. What's interesting is, you can evaluate a little bit of the story of the book of Ruth. We ask ourselves the question, is there anything wrong with this picture? Should they be taking wives from outside of the Israelite covenant community? We know that because in chapter 7 in the book of Deuteronomy, let's turn back to chapter 7 in Deuteronomy and remind ourselves of what Moses taught. In a faithful covenant community, these young boys brought up, and maybe they were too young to be taught properly, but for whatever reason, Moses says, when you, verse 3 in chapter 7, the whole purpose for driving out these pagan nations. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons. Why? Just because you want to be a cosmic killjoy? No, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods, and then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and then he'll quickly cause you to cease to exist as a nation, destroy you. All right, so the pagan influence can creep in. All right, so that's what we've got here. We can also look at Deuteronomy 28, chapter 28, verse 32, to see that in the instruction that Moses gives with regards to the covenant curses, being married to foreigners can bring about this judgment that comes out of Deuteronomy. So we have 10 years. They're in Moab for 10 years. 10 years of barrenness to Ruth and Orpah might be seen as maybe hidden judgment from the hand of the Lord, according to Deuteronomy 28:18. But then, if that wasn't bad enough, the tragedy of all tragedy occurs. Let's take a look at what happens next. Verse 5, then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the women were bereft of her 2 children and her husband. So this is the worst case scenario. You've got 3 widows, Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-laws, lost all husbands, and they have no sons to replace the head of household. So this is a tragic situation. And these women were exposed to, really pretty severe vulnerability in their context. For a woman at that time needed to be under some kind of oversight and maybe replugged back into a household structure for protection. So this was, in fact, the household of Elimelech, Naomi's husband, was on the verge of complete annihilation and destruction. What that means is there's no son to propagate the name of Elimelech, his name and his reputation into the future. The household ceases to exist as an entity at this point, unless something's done. So what we have here is a tragedy. While we're not back into Bethlehem yet, as we transition back to Bethlehem, as we'll see, we hope that something will change or something that will happen. In fact, a properly functioning covenant community, as we'll see, will be the exact right place to replant and to figure this situation out. So that's what we're hoping for. Households being cared for, the widows being provided for legally, all of these would have been true for a context in which the covenant community was acting as a covenant community. So let's see where this goes. But what we've seen so far, if we read Judges with Ruth, going back to the Promised Land seems to be the worst place to go on planet Earth if you're a roaming widow. Not the place to go back to. We've not seen good things come out of the book of Judges. So that might be somewhat looming in the backdrop of what happens next if you're a reader of the book of Ruth, having just read the book of Judges. We've seen that people in that place are doing what was right in their own eyes pretty much all the time. All right, so let's see where we go. So next in the story, we have a series of 3 exchanges between Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law. And the first one here starts in verse 6. So let's see here. Weston. Well, let's see. I don't want to start with first with Spence. I'm going to let you read here in chapter 1. Let's read verse 6 through 10.
She arose with her daughters-in-law to return to the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she sent out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with me, or dealt with the dead, and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people."
Okay, so that's verse 10. Okay, so verse 6 reminds us in a couple ways in returning to Bethlehem. But notice the Lord is providing for his people. The famine is over. Bethlehem is a term that the term means house of bread. So there's a lot of significance there. In verse 8, what we see in verse 8 is Naomi, the mother here-in-law, wanting to provide for the welfare of her daughters-in-law by allowing them to go back to their households, because that's going to be the safe place for them to go back to. She's not got any necessary guarantee future for them. The best place for them to go is stay home in Moab, go back to your households and regroup and find out, wait for the what next. So Naomi's going to bless them by asking the Lord here to demonstrate his blessing to them. There in verse 10, verse 8. Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May Yahweh deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. So we're going to see the Lord is, not only working behind the scenes, but, we see this is Naomi is a part of that covenant community. And she's praying and asking the blessing of Yahweh, the covenant God of the Israelites, to extend his blessing to these daughters-in-law to act in covenant faithfulness and mercy and grace. Those are attributes of the Lord. So Naomi is going to become kind of the embodiment of this idea. So Israel was supposed to be, as you know, extending covenant blessing to the nations around. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. One of the promises that God makes to the patriarch Abraham, that through you, Abraham, all the nations of the world will experience covenant blessing. So this is a little micro picture of that, I think. Verse 10 also suggests that Ruth and Orpah, after all that they've been through, are more attached now to Naomi than to their own households, to their own Moabite households. Remember, 10 years of living together. So let's see where this goes. So now we have this second exchange, verse 11 through 14. Now let's have Weston up here read that.
But Naomi replied, "Return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters. My wife is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Again, they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her.
There's a significance to the idea of clinging there, the idea of leave and cleave. Leave your parents and cleave to that cleaving word, root there is behind the same root there. The idea of clinging or sticking to. I think that's a better way of understanding it. Stick to. Ruth stuck to her, the idea. All right. So we see in Naomi's words, concerns continue to be focused on the implications for the households and the provision for the households. And Naomi cannot be the source for replacement sons in this case. She's too old. And 20 years is way too long for the daughters-in-laws to sit around and wait for her to produce sons should that miracle happen. So, and Naomi is just claiming the reality of this situation. I'm too old to remarry and to bear sons. And we see a sense that Naomi here is probably grieving loss. Pictured here, that's Naomi. No, I'm just kidding. A bitter old woman, maybe. She seems to, where's the idea? She seems to be in verse 13 there at the end. The hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. A little bit of blaming God, maybe in this situation. Now, maybe she's had some experience back home, seeing the impact of God's judgment against his own people. Maybe she's thinking that for some reason now, God's judging me and issuing judgment against me. That would have been a common understanding in those days for not being able, to be barren now because you're old, is somewhat of a judgment. So anyway, maybe she's a lot like the wife of Job. Maybe, think of her that way, grieving like Job and Job's wife, but Job's wife says to Job, just curse God and die, So this is what we say. So this is another raw nerve moment in God's word. She's grieving her family's exile because of famine, the death of her husband, and now the death of her sons. So like Job, she's lost a lot. And the barrenness of her own daughters-in-law, so she's bitter over this frustrating situation. So she's grieving. So now we have the third exchange, beginning in verse 15. Let's take a look at that. And, see, Kevin up here. Why don't you start reading verse 15 down through verse 18.
And she says, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more.
Okay, down through verse 18. Good. So I think there's probably very few, if any at all, places or utterances in the biblical context like this that convey Ruth's courage and her commitment. This is a very strong statement of loyalty and allegiance and fidelity. And it's really not matched, I don't think, anywhere. And with this declaration, I think it's safe to say that Ruth is now standing in line with a willingness to become part of Israel's faithful covenant community. With really like Abraham, she's standing with Abraham. Abraham called to leave behind household and family to go into this unnamed, place. Now Ruth is having to make a similar type of decision, leaving behind family, land, and Moabite gods. Now she's declaring her allegiance to this new household and this new extended nation and their God. So she's choosing to remain a widow and become an alien in a foreign land. That takes some spiritual guts to do. So I don't know if we can call this a true conversion experience yet, but entering into the covenant community will probably be something that takes a little time, and how the Lord will respond. Naomi gives in, and the two will return to Bethlehem. And Naomi continues to role as a bitter woman, I say. Verse 19. So they both went until they came back to Bethlehem. Verse 19. And it came about when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? And they said to them, and she said to them, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty El Shaddai has dealt very bitterly with me. That's what the name Mara means. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me and the El Shaddai has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the very beginning of the barley harvest. So this is a picture of someone, and it's interesting. We've seen warts and all, right? Different individuals in the biblical context struggling with their situation, and there's great authenticity here. And for the reader, the audience, the intended audience, the author's giving a full, very vivid color picture of what the life of faith sometimes looks like, right? Sometimes it's struggle. Sometimes there's loss, and sometimes there's bitterness that results when you're trying to work through it all and get to whatever the solution's going to be. Naomi's struggling and maybe waiting here for some kind of divine response, And we see a little glimmer of hope, and it's hidden. The beginning of barley harvest. Just a little detail right there at the end of verse 22. So it's not like the Lord's given up on her yet as a faithful covenant member. And that's when the scene changes. We see verse 122 down through chapter 2, verse 3. I'll just keep reading. Now Naomi, the author says, and oh, by the way, Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I might find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So verse 3, so she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. So here now, interestingly, arriving to the house of bread, Bethlehem, just in time for the barley harvest, right? So we see evidence, contrary to Naomi's bitterness and blaming God, that God shows up, working seemingly behind the scenes, extending chesed, that is covenant loyalty and blessing, to this struggling household in a couple ways. One, perfectly timed barley harvest. Two, a perfectly placed, faithful male Israelite named Boaz. And when we are faithful ourselves, I think sometimes we can be perfectly placed for the extending of God's blessing to others. I'll have to tell you this story. This one. While I was gone, not here, I was in the Evangelical Theological Society meetings in Providence, Rhode Island. And it was fun. I took my wife, Ellen, and we went together. And she's really good because, you're in this Evangelical Theological Society where all these old scholars are walking around with gray hair, and they're all boring and stoic and stogie and not friendly. I'm just exaggerating. But you can picture this, right? So two of my heroes in the field of Old Testament studies. One is an ancient Near Eastern expert, Alan Millard. I really like Alan Millard because he's my academic grandfather. He supervised my PhD supervisor, Daniel Block, back in the day. And Daniel Block supervised my PhD experience. So I always remind him of this whenever I go to these sessions. I always attend his session. And he presented. He's probably 90. He's still active in the guild. It's just amazing. And he was there with his wife. And so Ellen and I were walking around, and I actually told her, hey, we're going to go to this session of, we're going to go to this session of Alan Millard. And so there he was, standing in the lobby. We got off the elevator, and he looked a little bit confused. He was talking to somebody, and I walked up and said, Dr. Millard, are you having trouble figuring out where to go in this big hotel and find out the room? And let me help you get to where you're going. So Ellen and I helped him get to his session, and we were like perfectly placed at just the right time to help Dr. Alan Millard. And then later in the day, or I think it was the next day, he was walking with his wife, and they were walking together, and they came out of the elevator, and they said, we don't know where we're supposed to go. How do we find where our room is? Which, their hotel room. And we know how to help them, and we helped both him and his wife turn the corner and find their way to the other set of elevators where you go up, and we helped them pick the button and get to their room. My other hero of the faith is Walter Kaiser, who happened to also be there with his wife. So here we are. What do we do for them? Oh, and I got a picture with Alan Millard and his wife. It was really cool. So Walter Kaiser was also there with his wife. And then the last day, because you have to check out at 11, there's still sessions going on into the afternoon. You have to check out early. You have to figure out where you're going to put your suitcase, right, when you check out of your room. So the hotel had provided this extra overflow room for the luggage that you have. So you have to take your luggage to this place. So again, Ellen and I are walking around and turn the corner, and there standing there was Walter Kaiser with his wife and 3 sets of luggage. And they're walking around. And we had just come back from this room. So then we were perfectly placed and timed, ready to take and help Dr. Kaiser and his wife get to the luggage room. So I don't know. That's probably underwhelming. I'm sorry. It was just funny that I was there and perfectly placed, perfectly timed. All right. So when you're ready to be faithful, God has a job for you if you're faithful. So Ruth's question in chapter 2. Let's take a look at it. Chapter 2, verse 2. And she says, "Please may I go into the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I might find favor." It's as if Ruth is expecting someone in the covenant community to be faithful. And faithful to what? Leviticus 19. Let's take a look. Leviticus, you probably know some of these verses. You've probably had this preached before, but it's there. Moses has taught one of the expressions of the covenant community in providing for the needs of the poor and needy in the community has already been detailed out. Chapter 19 in Leviticus, verse 9 and 10. "And when you reap the harvest of your land, and you shall not reap on the very corners of your field, neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy, for the stranger. I am Yahweh your God." You can see the same thing in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19. It's repeated. A properly functioning covenant community provides for the needs of the poor and needy. So that's interesting. In fact, you'll be talking about that in your group discussion question this week a little bit. So hopefully that'll be fun and helpful. So this was the way a covenant community was to provide for the needs of the widows, the orphans, and the aliens. It seems like Ruth represents at least the widow and the alien, one from outside of the covenant community. In verse 3, here's how it reads in the Hebrew. "And so she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she chanced upon," sorry, my eyes are a little blurry. Chanced upon the allotted portion of the field of Boaz. It's emphatic in the Hebrew. Chanced upon. In other words, the author is making sure that we see that this was not luck, right? This was the Lord who was at work here. Don't just, chanced upon is an emphatic way of saying she walked into a scenario that was divinely provided by the Lord. That's what's going on here. So here's the author theologically screaming off the page. So in order for the divine agenda to advance, Ruth had to land in the just right field at the just right time and meet up with the just right Israelite who had been both kind and from the right family, in other words. So all of this, he had to be a kinsman redeemer. He had to be from the right family, in other words. So all of these things are lining up with Boaz. And we meet him finally in verse 4 in chapter 2. "Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, 'May the Lord be with you.' And they said, 'May the Lord bless you,' which speaks volumes of Boaz's faithful relationship that he had with his worker bees, his members of his household who were helping him with the harvesting of the fields at that time. there's this mutual community of covenant charge. I don't know what you might call it, but I'm going to bless you. You bless me in response and all of this. So keep going here in verse 5. Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant in charge of the reapers answered and said, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And she said, 'Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves.' Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while." All right, so down through verse 7. So we see this exchange with his workers. It just confirms Boaz's role in Bethlehem, this as a faithful member of this seemingly, for the most part, thriving covenant community. So he's extending blessing now to not only to his workers. Let's keep going here. And we see now Boaz extending this covenant loyalty or this blessing. I keep saying chesed, that's covenant loyalty. But because of this extending of covenant loyalty, there'll be the receiving of blessing to widows, orphans, and aliens. In chapter 2, let's look at verse 8 and over here. Let's have Michael. Could you begin reading in verse 8 and see what happens here, down through verse 14.
And Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the fields that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? When you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink, but the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, fell onto the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and your mother and your native land and came to the people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come to take refuge." He said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord. For you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, but I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread, and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied.
Okay, good. So down through verse 14. So what's interesting, you see verse 10, when Ruth has this response, she falls on her face, is the posture of submission or humility, and asks the question in verse 10, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner? That's an interesting question, right? And what Boaz recognizes is a couple things. One is the covenant loyalty that Ruth demonstrates even while she's in Moab to Naomi. In other words, that earlier conversation and exchange that happened between Naomi and Ruth with regards to Ruth's dramatic statement of loyalty was in and of itself a demonstration. And the willingness to come back and provide for and care for Naomi along the way was all what a covenant member looks like. And here it is coming from a non-Israelite. So she's demonstrating and she's demonstrating really what covenant fidelity looks like if you're part of the covenant community. So it's interesting that Boaz recognizes that in her as well. And then in verse 12, "May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." So it's interesting, Boaz recognizes the allegiance that Ruth gives assent to in terms of the covenant God of the Israelites. This is similar language to what we saw way back in the book of Exodus. You remember when we were at Mount Sinai the marriage ceremony that occurs in the exchange of words. You remember Moses says in Exodus 19, starting in verse 4, Moses says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and have brought you to myself." So that intimate language, that exchange of words, that's salvation language. You know, the idea that God's wings are over you and are hovering over you, and that idea of protecting you. So it might be a little bit of an echo there, but seeking refuge under the wings of Yahweh, that's what Ruth is doing. And Boaz recognizes that, and that's significant. So Boaz now is going to extend blessing and covenant loyalty now to Ruth. As an active member now, one covenant member serving another covenant member within the covenant community. So protection under his household, that's the first thing that has to be wrestled to the ground, which is really protection under the household of Boaz now becomes an extension of Yahweh's wings and the protection that the Lord is going to provide for this widow and this alien. So provision for Ruth now and Naomi, two widows, and Ruth also being an alien. So this is part of the covenant community at work. Just as a pause, this is the actual question that I'm posing all of you to think about this week in your groups. You know, what about our churches, and how should churches think about themselves as a covenant community in providing for the needs of the poor, the widows, and the orphans that are all around us? That's a real challenge, is it not? I mean, we get into legal discussions and what can we really do, and how do we help people who are in difficult situations, or are we like this picture, you know, drawing a line in the sand with regards to, you know, the sneetches with blue stars and the sneetches with red stars. That's
Sneetches without stars and sneetches with stars.
Is it Dr. Seuss? Did I get that wrong?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
My nephews all the time.
No, it's red.
Sneetches without.
Oh. Okay. I should just bring that book in and read it, because it's a great illustration. No. But this is that poverty, you know, we've got wealth, and then just across the fence there's poverty. And obviously these people are too busy to think about the needs of the people over there in a pretty dramatic picture. But not Boaz, and not in Bethlehem. So that's my point there. So Ruth chapter 2, verse 15. We see Boaz following through in a very significant way with regards to what he's going to do. Verse 15. So when she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servant, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. You also shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles, and leave it so she may glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening, and she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley, and she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. You see this double blessing happening, you know, in a covenant community. This is what happens. It's kind of like what you do when you go through Starbucks and you buy the cup of coffee for the person behind you in line. Have you ever tried that? Kind of fun. Not that we should be drinking Starbucks. No, I'm just kidding. But Ellen and I do that sometimes just for fun. I don't know. It's just fun. So the play it forward kind of thing. That's what happens. The blessing is just multiplied within a covenant community when all cylinders are firing. Her mother-in-law then said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where did you work?" Kind of like she's shocked. "May he who took notice of you be blessed." This is blessing going on all over the place. So she took her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead." That's interesting. We'll come back to that. Again, Naomi said to her, "This man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives." So now it's all coming together. Then Ruth, let's see, I think I want to stop there. We'll stop there. So this reference in verse 20, not only to the living, which is obviously Boaz's blessing the household of Naomi and the household of Ruth. That's blessing to the living, but also blessing to the dead, to the deceased. Now we have the extension of Boaz's faithfulness and fidelity being an extended blessing now to the household of the deceased, aka Elimelech, right? That's what we have. That's the household that's in crisis. And an ethaf was a lot of grain, somewhere between 30 and 50 pounds of grain, which was the double blessing that Boaz and his workers gave Ruth. So the Lord is providing for Ruth behind the scenes. Covenant grace is being extended to Naomi and Ruth through this portion of the faithful remnant in Israel. And now we come to this kinsman redeemer role. Let's go back to Leviticus. Again, some of the teaching that Moses left the Israelites before entering the Promised Land. Chapter 25, verse 25 through 30. Leviticus chapter 25, beginning in verse 25. If a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. Or in the case of a man, if he has no kinsman, but so recovers his means as to find sufficient for its redemption, then he shall calculate the years since its sale and refund the balance to the man who has sold it, and so return to his property. But if he has not found sufficient means to get it back for himself, then what he has sold shall remain in the hands of its purchaser until the year of Jubilee. But at Jubilee it shall revert, that he may return to his property. The one thing that I want to see is in verse 25. Let's see. Maybe the one I want to look at is in chapter 27. Leviticus chapter 27, verse, no. 7, that's not it. Okay. So this is this idea of the kinsman redeemer. This is the role of Boaz. That's the point I wanted to make. In other words, the function of the kinsman, the one who's involved in this redemption activity, here's what he's supposed to do. Ensure that the property of the clan stay with the clan or the household. He's also going to ensure that the freedom of the members of the clan who have been sold into slavery, he's going to provide for them. He's going to execute justice on behalf of the household. So he'll also represent the household in any judicial kinds of transactions. So this is the kinsman redeemer, family member who will step in and, you might say, become the legal consultation for the household with regards to property, which also includes land. It also includes if I've sold myself as a servant, so I'm owned by somebody else for a period of time, of course, up to the year of Jubilee and all that. So it's interesting, nowhere in the biblical text mentions the role of the kinsman in this idea of marrying the widow of the deceased person. That's a separate discussion in the biblical context. All right, so where we go for that, let me fix my screen here. But where we go for that is in Deuteronomy chapter 25. So that will be a different subject. So we've got two things going on here. One is the role of the kinsman redeemer, kind of the legal consult that Boaz will also provide. But then later we have this other provision, and that's the Levirate marriage idea. So that's Deuteronomy chapter 25. Let's turn there. All right, Deuteronomy 25 and verse 5 through 10. When brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside of the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as a wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son whom she bears shall assume the name of the dead brother. That would be Elimelech in this case, that his name may not be blotted out from Israel. But if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name or reputation eternally or ongoing for his brother in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come in to him in sight of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall declare, quote, thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. So how serious was this? This idea of continuing to provide for the name, the ongoing existence of the household, name, reputation, and all of that. So this is the provision of the Levirate marriage. Now I'm just going to skip over a couple slides here. One significant thing that I make here is just the significance of Bethlehem, kind of the backdrop of this whole faithful context for this faithful covenant community. The significance of the think of the small town church, small town community. I mean, it's providing very interesting characters. Bethlehem, for example, Boaz steps out of this community, and he contributes significantly to the future of where Israel will go. When Samuel goes to find a king, he goes to and finds, and the Lord sends him to Jesse the Bethlehemite. Jesse, a.k.a. the one from Bethlehem, right? And that's where he goes to find King David. So, in other words, this is the community that, right here, small country church. This is where David went to church, in Bethlehem. I mean, Bethlehem at the time of Jesus was maybe population 1,000. During the time of Ruth, probably closer to 300 to maybe 600 people. Really small. But notice the huge contribution that Bethlehem makes in history. We even have some of the prophets being influenced in and around the same, you might call it the Bible Belt, just south of Jerusalem. And some of these towns down there were very significant, faithful covenant communities making a huge contribution in the salvation history of Israel. Somebody taught King David how to trust in the Lord and take on the giants. He runs out on the battlefield, having his theology correct when everybody around him was getting it wrong, especially King Saul. But he takes on the Philistine giant named Goliath, right? He's also pretty good with the sling because he grew up on the farm, warding off the lions, tigers, and bears wanting to attack the family herds of sheep. So he had not only the skills to fight physically, but also the theology to fight the battles. He knew who would win the battle for him. My point is, the community of Bethlehem and all those little praying grandmas that would sit in the front row, they were the ones who helped him get his theological teeth cut, I think. All right, now we get to our deep thought picture. Our last one of the semester. Is the book of Ruth all about this wonderful love story? Is it the hallmark card of the Old Testament? Well, what we have to remind ourselves, unlike this picture, Boaz, hopefully we're seeing that Boaz is acting in covenant fidelity and loyalty to God. His relationship was with God first. And in fact, if you remember, the word for love in the Old Testament really means loyalty. Loyalty is what is all about that. So Boaz is acting loyalty first to God, but almost, as a kind of the aftermath of him maintaining his loyal relationship to God in the midst of the covenant community. The overflow of that is now this relationship that he has with Ruth. So I don't think we don't want to get too far away from the love equals loyalty idea, because Boaz is being loyal to Ruth, whether or not there's this warm, gushy, warm, fuzzy feelings inside for Boaz, between Boaz and Ruth. I don't know if we need to go there right away in the text. Ruth's acting loyalty, she's acting loyally, Boaz is acting loyalty. And somewhere in the midst of that, you're going to eventually have have this household that begins. She needs to be in a household with a man. So now what we have in the text down in chapter 3, Naomi will step in and see that the solution that's necessary is going to be a proper application of the kinsman redeemer rule of Boaz. So there's now what Naomi seems to recognize is that, and eventually I think not only that, the kinsman redeemer, but the eventual application of the Levirate marriage law that we see and we saw from Deuteronomy chapter 25. So let's take a look at chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. So then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you? Let it me be well with you." That's well with you. "And now, is it not Boaz, our kinsman, with whose maid you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight." All right, so that's she's recognizing Boaz as the provision for, he's the one who needs to step in here and step into the shoes of the kinsman as the kinsman redeemer. So verse 3, let's take a look at verse 3. So here's what Naomi instructs her daughter-in-law to do. "So wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do." So she says to her, "All that you say I will do." So what do you think of a mother-in-law instructing her daughter-in-law to bathe, put on perfume, and then in the dark of night go to a place where a man would be sleeping and uncover his legs? Now it gets interesting, doesn't it? So now what's even more interesting is if you know anything about these small towns, the threshing floors, because of the activity outside of the city gates, were common places for prostitutes to gather and meet up with the men who have been working in the fields all day. And after merriment, whoever knows what happens after that, into the hours of the night. So common place for a prostitute to go meet up with potential customers, threshing floors outside of the city gates or outside away from the city center. So are Naomi and Ruth thinking of forcing the situation by seducing Boaz toward sex? Is that what we see going on in the text? Huh? There's tension in the room. Where's the professor going to go with this? In 15 minutes left in the lecture. All right. I don't think so. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure commentaries go all over the place with this. I think that scenario might force the storyline a little bit too much. Why do I say that? Here's what I say. So I'm building the case against that. I don't think that Naomi is wanting to bring about some kind of deception or seduction here. All right? Here's what I think. And it's what we know about Boaz up to this point. What have we seen in the text with regards to Boaz? He's a man of grace. He's a man of integrity. Right? Boaz, so far, there's nothing in Boaz to suggest he's outside of the perfect picture of a male member of the covenant community. And Naomi knows this about Boaz. Naomi does not dress her daughter up in her daughter-in-law. She does not dress her up as a prostitute. I don't think that's the case. Also, in the details of the Hebrew terms, Ruth is not uncovering the genitals of Boaz with the details of what we read. I take the high road here and think of the interpretation that Naomi is encouraging Ruth to offer herself to Boaz as a solution to the Levirate marriage law. In addition, I think Ruth's posture in proximity to Boaz in the night here may place, and at that place may actually put Ruth in a position of protecting Boaz from other women of the night. That might be part of the situation here. She's not come for sex. She has come to extend covenant loyalty to Boaz. Does that make sense? Here another way to say it. Ruth is coming to Boaz to offer herself as a wife with this late night proposition. All right, so that's what it looks like. That's a real picture taken. Chapter 3, verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and she came secretly and uncovered his feet, not his genitals, and lay down. And it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a kinsman redeemer," close relative. Then he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first, by not going after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." See? Ruth's reputation. Boaz's reputation. Now Ruth's reputation is, she's put, by doing this, by coming and saying, what about we've got this situation here. Could it be solved by the application of the levirate marriage law? Because you're the kinsman redeemer and you can legally work out the scenario for this. That's what she's offering here. And now Boaz is even committed to the protection of the reputation of Ruth. Here's what he says, "And now it is true. I am a close relative. I'm a kinsman redeemer. However, there is a kinsman redeemer closer than I. I'll have to work those details out later. But remain this night. And when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good. Let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I'll redeem you. As Yahweh lives, lie down until morning." In other words, lie down until morning. We're not going to go out of here so that people see you walking around in the area. I'm going to protect your reputation as well, Boaz says to Ruth. So she's asking him to marry him as a provision for the levirate marriage law. She asks him to extend his wings of chesed over him in the context of a marriage relationship. So I think that's what we have going on here. And this is only strengthened in how this exchange between Boaz and Ruth plays out in the text here. Instead of cursing her or treating her like a prostitute, you don't see any of that going off. He offers a blessing at the end. He recognizes her noble character and that her character has remained consistent in the community. She has now a reputation of being a loyal covenant community member. And she's risen to the top, not because she's hobnobbed with the wealthy or given herself over to other men. He acknowledges that. She's a lot like Joseph. Behind the scenes, because of her loyalty, the Lord has come in and allowed her to elevate as a female member of the covenant community. All right? So I think that's what we need to do here with this. And Boaz cuts to the chase here in verse 14 and 15. Ruth must remain and wait until morning because he's got to find out what the verdict is going to be. So he's going to have to go into town the next day and deal with the legal implications of the situation as a kinsman redeemer, so that if it's possible, the levirate marriage could be applied as well. So Ruth returns to Naomi in verses 16 through 18, and they're going to wait until the next day and wait for Boaz to offer his report. Naomi seems very confident that the man of character, the reputation and integrity will act. This man, Boaz, will act and settle the matter in the right way. So I think throughout this whole context, the emphasis needs to be on the consistent character of Boaz as well as the consistent character of Naomi. And we get to the end, and chapter 4, we see the next day Boaz is going to a place pictured here, Dr. Eric Mitchell at Tel Gezer. Boaz will go to a place that from an aerial view will look something like this. So outside of the walls of the city, there's city gates. So this would be an entryway into the city, and see those side rooms that you see, those 6 rooms, kind of looks like, I don't know, that's where the elders of the city would be to settle legal matters, and that's where Boaz goes the next day. So Boaz went up to the gate and sat down, and behold, the close relative, the kinsman redeemer of whom Boaz spoke, was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned and sat down. Verse 1, verse 2. Then Boaz, he took 10 men of the elders of the city and sat down. "Sit down here." So they sat down. You see now this is his role as kinsman redeemer, providing for the legal matters and dealing with it. So that's what's going on. He says to the closest relative, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land. So there's the property that's involved, which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, "Buy it before those who are sitting here, and behold the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me what, that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it. I am after you." And he said, "I'll redeem it." Then Boaz says, "On the day you buy the field from the land, from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance." And the closest relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I jeopardize my own inheritance." "Redeem it for yourself. You have my right of redemption." So he's now handing over his right of redemption to Boaz, "For I cannot redeem it." Let's see. So that's, and then there's the exchange of the sandal in verse 8. And then, so what happens here at the end of this chapter 4 is that you see the details of Boaz handling the situation with regards to the legal matter. And this is the courtroom drama, but it's, we covered a lot of details. I'm kind of covering it quickly. What's important to know about the legal settling of the matter is it's going to continue and provide for the name of Elimelech, the household of Elimelech. Now, Boaz has acted with covenant loyalty towards the household of Elimelech, and providing for a way of providing, the next generation of the household of Elimelech. And this will be important in chapter 4. Let's see, verses 9 through 12. Let's look at that really quick. Then Boaz says to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name, right, of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased may not be cut off from his brothers, or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today." And all the people who were in the court and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May Yahweh make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore Judah, through the offspring which the Lord shall give you by this young woman." So there's historical precedent for this. And that's Genesis 38 that we saw earlier. There's some connections there that I make in this slide between the story of Tamar and the story of Ruth. Both of them were, interestingly, in very similar situations. But unlike Tamar, who was in the middle of a Levirate law controversy in Israel, for Tamar, it involved getting the attention of a significant male. Same way for Ruth, but the difference is this. Tamar, she was ignored as time passed. But Ruth, she was recognized as time passed. For Tamar, she had to resort to drastic measures to get the attention of the male through the confusion of her being a prostitute. But Ruth, I argue against her being a prostitute to get the attention of Boaz. She must resort to drastic measures to get the attention of the male, but not through being a prostitute. I would argue against that. Tamar, she was recognized as a prostitute, seen who for she was not. But Ruth, in contrast, she was recognized as a woman of noble character, seen for who she is. That's the contrast. And I think finally, the Levirate law is enacted based on manipulation in Genesis 38, but for Ruth, it's based on and enacted on covenant loyalty and the character of Boaz. So the significance of all this is how, we see that in the aftermath that we read. Boaz took Ruth, verse 13, and she became his wife and went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a resorter of life and the sustainer of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons," that's the number of perfection, the perfect household, better than that, has given birth to him. And then we see the genealogy there that we read earlier. So the climax of the book of Ruth happens 9 months later in the home of Boaz and Ruth. So let's see, what do I want to look at here? Well, just 3 minutes left. What's 17? Verse 17. I want to make sure we get to the significance of this. And the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So here's the connection. The household of Elimelech. The name Elimelech, my God is king. That's what the name means. So it's interesting that the book of Ruth, the author, is helping us to see the significance of how the faithfulness of Boaz leads to the fullness of the reputation of the name Elimelech, my God is king, being fulfilled in who? King David. And whatever future leaps off of King David with regards to the future. So I think that's the significance of the name Elimelech, because we see the full meaning, you might say, the name of Elimelech being recognized in the genealogy that the author here, the author of the book of Ruth, gives us at the very end. All right. And I think that's just one little slide. So that's the fullness of the name Elimelech. Kind of what I was trying to do here, but you see the question over king. There was no king in Israel, the book of Judges, the book of Ruth. But out of the chaos, King David will emerge finally through the prophetic ministry of Samuel. But I think the combination of Judges and Ruth together are anticipating the coming king, and that's the question of king. There was no king in Israel. Do we need an earthly king, or is it going to be some other kind of king? Well, it's going to eventually be. I think what's going on here is this anticipation of the day when God himself will be king. That's that future that we saw when we read 2 Samuel chapter 7 and the Davidic covenant. So God will be rethroned as king. That's the ultimate solution. All right? So I think that's what we have. One more slide. Unsettled business sets us up for our spring class, Old Testament Survey 2, where we have some of the unresolved issues of the book of Judges and the book, really primarily the book of Judges. We're going to have to see if this resolution happens with regards to this 400 years of chaos. Who will take up the spiritual baton of leadership in the land? Again, I've been asking this question. I think that's the big question. What kind of king will it require to establish Israel and bring her back to her spiritual foundations? And finally, when will it be that Israel will be a true kingdom of priests and a holy nation, according to the Segulah promise of Exodus 19:4 and 5? All right, enough to say about the book of Ruth. So we'll finish tonight, this afternoon, still late afternoon. If you want to come back next week, and we'll have a chalkboard talk about the review. I'll have it recorded as well. So I'd like to have a few live members of the audience if you come back. Maybe I'll make it worth your while. Maybe my wife will make her famous chocolate chip cookies next week. You're going to be here? All right. Sorry for you out there. We can't send you chocolate chip cookies, but we'll surely eat them in front of you next week. All right. Thanks, everyone, for your attention.